by title. Title ready? Seconds before. Stand by camera 4. 3, 2, 1. Title, stand by 3 mic count.
Good evening and welcome to another workshop on the web. I'm Carolyn Jones with the Department of Social and Health Services. We want to thank you for your time this evening. We're back this evening with Gary Benton, who will be talking to us about and with us about dealing with challenging behaviors in kids in care. We want to also let you know that we have some future plans that are in the works right now, and just keep an eye out on our website so that you'll know when they're about to be offered. We'll be doing one on Indian child welfare in the next several months, one on eating disorders, and also one on the effects of domestic violence on child development. And more will be in production as the fall progresses. On your screen today, I want to call your attention to the buttons to the right of your screen. The one that says Ask a Question will enable you, while still receiving the transmission, to email us with questions. And we'd like to hear from you. Even if you don't have a question, email us and let us know where you're listening from. We want to welcome our friends in the states of Texas and Ohio this evening. I've heard from several people this week that caught Gary last week and really liked what they heard, and so we want to welcome them back, as well as all of our foster parents in Washington. The 800 number to call, if you would prefer to use the telephone for questions, 1-800-407-9487. And with that, I'd like to welcome Gary back again to our podium, and I'll be taking telephone calls and giving them to Gary. Gary, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Well, good evening again, and for those of you in Texas, howdy. You know, I was down there last month, down in Waco, and it was great fun working with teachers. I'm going to talk a little slower. I understand that would be a helpful thing for some of you. It's my mother's fault, of course, that I talk fast, and that's one of those things. Tonight, I want to start by talking about 4 basic psychological needs. You guys are working with kids who's had many of their needs challenged in lots of different ways. And we're going to look at just some of those needs and some things that you can do that might be preventive in terms of working with kids, starting off the relationship better, or if things have gone kind of sideways on you, ways to kind of go back to the basics. And we're also going to go back and look at the brain model and talk specifically about discipline and about things that you can do within that, and some structures and some different things that you can do with that. So that's where we're going to start. At the end of the evening, I want to take probably the last, I don't know, maybe 6, 7, 8 minutes, and just talk about you, some things that you can do for your own personal self-care, some ways to kind of reduce your own stress. These kids are real tough, and now and then you just need a break, and so I want to talk a little bit about that, too, at the end. Feel free to ask questions. Happy to answer them. If you do, try to give us information about the age and the sex of the child, because that helps kind of put a context in it for us. So here we go. So we're going to talk about these 4 basic psychological needs. There's the first and most important one is belonging. It's the need to be part of a group or a family. For those of you taking notes, I'll give you a second to write that down. But from a perspective, a human perspective, this is a big deal. When we take a look at people who don't belong, they turn out to be typically the most dangerous people in our society. When we look at people with attachment disorders and things like that, for example, over 90% of the adult men in prison will test out as unattached. When we take a look at the guy who's most likely to walk back to work and shoot people after being laid off, typically it's the guy who's not only lost his job, but also has recently lost his wife or his partner, his girlfriend, something like that. And when we take a look at children who are likely to walk back into school and be violent after being kicked out, they're also kids that are typically cut out of their peer groups and whose families are falling apart. So when we talk about the belonging need and being attached, it is a big deal. And of course, for those of you who have foster kids, you know in the beginning you get kind of these odd behaviors. The kids are moving in. Sometimes you get that nice little honeymoon period where you just kind of wonder, wow, gee, I heard all these reports about this kid. I was expecting somebody much worse. And lo and behold, they're just cool. You know, they're great kids, and you think, oh, this is just wonderful. And once they kind of settle in, then, of course, the lid comes off, and it gets very exciting. I'm going to talk about why that happens, because that's something else. It's good news when the lid comes off, just so you know. But this first need is a big deal, and it's true for you too. This isn't different for a child as opposed to an adult or anybody. If you can think about the last time you maybe began a job, my guess is the first week, by the end of the first week, you just went home exhausted. And it wasn't that the job was so difficult. My guess is if you're in it still, you're feeling, you have a lot more responsibility, you're working a lot harder, all kinds of things, but you go home this Friday pretty much like you went home last Friday. But it's all that fitting in stuff. It's trying to figure out how do I talk, and what do I wear, and where do we eat lunch, and where do you find the pencils, and who has that form that I have to, and all this stuff about fitting in. Well, your foster child comes into your family in exactly the same mode. They're trying to figure out how to fit in. And every time their attachment need is challenged, they go back to it. So this is a big deal. You always want to be working on this. The next need is the power need. Now, power is influence. What that means that once I fit into this group or family, then I want my opinion to count, my voice to be heard. I simply want to be able to influence this group or family of which I'm a part. And when I mentioned earlier, when the lid comes off, if you will, the child's finally in, they're kind of settling down, and all of a sudden you get this crazy kind of behavior, whatever it might be, what you're probably experiencing is a child who's trying to have influence, a child who is doing whatever he or she can to try to have an effect on the group. As I mentioned last week, I was the director of a group home for teenage boys for several years. And we had one, I'll never forget this one young man. He came in. I'll call him Bill. Actually, you'll notice I call all my boys Bill and all my girls Sarah. That way I don't have to give away any names or confidences, but I'll call him Bill. 15 years old, neat young kid. Very bright, and he moved into one of our homes. Now, we ran basically therapeutic foster homes. So he had a foster parent, and this particular house parent was Ginny. And Ginny was just very, very experienced, a wonderful foster parent or therapeutic foster parent. When he came in, and this is typical, she always made a big deal dinner. Now, he was moving into a house with 5 other guys, so there were now 6 teenagers in this house. And so, of course, food is a big deal for teenagers, as you know. So she made turkey with mashed potatoes and gravy and dressing, just this wonderful dinner. And Bill had been in the house maybe a couple of hours. Anyway, he came up. And he sat down. Now, let me give you a little context about Bill. When he was growing up, he had 2 counselors as parents. And if you've ever seen Cheers and you've seen Lilith on Cheers, both of them were Lilith. He had a very, very hard time influencing his parents at all. They just analyzed everything he did, but he had very little influence. So eventually he broke out and started influencing the neighbors by ripping them off, and that's how he wound up in our group home. So we brought him in. He came up and called all the boys up. And before Bill had even sat down at dinner, he reached into the mashed potatoes with his bare hands and picked up a handful and plopped them on his plate. I think he was trying to have an effect on Ginny. And in fact, he did. She marched him out, and don't know, never heard any yelling or screaming or anything like that, but he came back in about 3 minutes, and a miracle had taken place. He'd learned to say please and thank you and pass the potatoes and things like that. I asked her later how did she manage his behavior, and she said, well, I just mentioned to him if he ever did it again, he just wouldn't eat, and of course that's a big deal. I'm not sure she would ever follow that up, but he was trying to have influence. He wanted to see if he was going to have an effect in that house. And he did. He and Ginny, by the way, became great friends. And he wound up living with us through the graduation from high school and went on to college. So he did very well, actually. The next need is for freedom. Freedom is choices. The more choices I have, the more freedom I feel. And it's very important that kids feel that they have choices, that they have more than one way to do anything. You are no different than I am. It's an interesting thing to take a look at. Americans particularly are interested in having choices. And so that's one of those things. So whenever we're working with our kids, we're always trying to give them the opportunity to choose. The other thing to keep in mind is that your long-range goal, of course, is that you're really raising an adult. You're not raising a child. And in the long haul, you really want kids to be good problem solvers. And the only way to be good problem solvers is to learn that there is more than one choice to any situation. And so you are always working on that. And then finally, the last need is for fun. It's a fundamental need. It's the need to laugh, to give it up, to be irresponsible, however you want to think about that. And you will define fun different than I will define fun. But it is a fundamental human need. And when you take a look at people who are successful, they manage to meet all 4 of those needs on a pretty routine basis in their life. It builds their self-esteem, it builds their confidence, it builds their ability to solve problems. When we look at these needs, they are not difficult to meet. We'll start up at the top here with the belonging need. The belonging need with kids is basically met 2 ways. It's met by looking and by touching. So if you look at kids, you make eye contact with them, and you put your hands on them, the odds are they're going to feel more bonded to you. Now, as I mentioned last week, I do a lot of work with teachers around the United States. And one of the things that's rather interesting about teacher behavior is the more difficult the child is in a classroom, the less eye contact he or she gets from the teacher. But that's also true in just about any setting you want, including family settings. In fact, most of you, if any of you have teenagers right now, you've had this experience where you walk up to this teenager and you want to say something to them, and the first thing they do is they just look away. Do you know how frustrating? You remember how frustrating that is? It's like, will you look at me when I'm talking to you? And you get all of that kind of behavior going on. Well, that's the looking need. What is happening with that is that by not looking, the communication to you is, you're not important to me. You don't count. And so one of the things that you want to be very careful about with your kids is that as soon as you connect with them, you look at them. You make good eye contact. Now, different cultures have all kinds of different rules about eye contact. You want to be sensitive to that. But the other side is you don't want to miss it, because children are looking to see if you notice. Whether you hold it, how long you hold it, all that stuff, you can figure that out on your own. But that initial eye contact is very important. It's the same thing with touching. Touching is a critical need. In fact, when we take a look at how children bond, it's very important that touch is a part of that. I directed an adoption agency for 3 years, and we placed kids from Eastern Europe with people all over the United States. And we were reading some research, and one of the things that was rather interesting is that people in the southern part of the United States were having fewer attachment and bonding problems with their adoptive kids than people in the northern part of the United States. And so we thought maybe it had to do with culture, it had to do with family, it had to do with society in general in the South is different from the North, or whatever it turned out to be. But anyway, when the researchers got down to it, what it turned out to be was short sleeves. It turns out skin-to-skin bonding really improves, skin-to-skin touching, excuse me, really improves bonding. So when you're looking at your child, it's very important that maybe you want to hold their hand, you might want to stroke a cheek. Those kinds of things are very important, because what that does, it allows the child to touch. Now, some of you might have touch-sensitive kids, and you want to be wise about that. But even with those kids, anything you can do to help children figure out how to touch you, that really does work. And this is going to sound, I'm not trying to suggest for a moment that children are dogs, but I do want you, if you have a dog, pay attention to what your dog does when you come home from work, whatever it might be. You may notice that that dog just will not leave you alone. And the reason for that is a dog is a pack animal. It knows that in order to fit well in the pack, it has to reconnect. Well, the truth is humans are pack animals too. We need to reconnect. So when we're looking at this stuff, we're always looking for an opportunity to look at the child and touch them, or have them touch us. I'm going to give you the 4 most important minutes that I can in terms of your day. Actually, probably the 8 most important minutes. You can think of it either way. The first is the first 4 minutes in the morning. And the last is the last 4 minutes at night. What happens is those minutes, those 4 minutes, are your opportunity to connect with the child. And one of the things that I would certainly suggest that you do is when you have an opportunity, particularly if you can wake up the child, and you want to think wisely about that too. Teenagers don't necessarily want people in their room. But the first 4 minutes in the morning, if you can just look at the child, you don't have to talk or do those kinds of things, and put your hands on them or have their hands on you, what will happen is you will begin to bond. And we're talking about reconnecting at every transition. The most important transition is in the morning. Another important transition is at night. If you have more than one child in your home, I would certainly suggest that they have different bedtimes, even if it's only by 15 or 20 minutes. It doesn't have to be a big deal spread, but you want to probably start with the youngest going to bed first and the oldest going to bed last. But if you can take 4 minutes, those last 4 minutes, to listen to the child, to look at them, to talk to them, to put your hands on them, they on you. What that does is it lets them fall asleep knowing that they are part of this family, part of this group, their belonging needs are being met. Another important transition time, of course, is after school or after work. Whenever it is, sort of you reconnect with kids as they're coming home or you're coming home, those kinds of things too. All of that opportunity really helps. But if the child doesn't feel that they belong, all bets are off. Nothing else is going to matter. And so this attachment stuff, this is a big, big deal. The power need, this influence need, is met by listening. And essentially, there's two ways to listen. We listen with our ears, what we call active listening, and we listen with our bodies, which means that we mirror how the child looks. I'll talk about the first one first, this business of active listening. It's very important that the child knows that they're having an effect on you. Okay, it's personal. And so whenever we're talking to a child, if we can reflect back to them what we think we've heard them say, and particularly if we can add a feeling word, it gives the child the idea that, oh my goodness, somebody heard me. And it is very important. Now, most of you have had this experience. I certainly have had this experience where you're talking to somebody and they're absolutely flat-faced. They're not responding at all. And finally, you just look at them and say, well, are you listening to me? Well, what's going on is you're not getting any feedback. So if you can give feedback to the child, say, even it's, I laugh about this, but it's really true. There are what my daughter calls, my daughter is now almost 21, she calls man noises. And she's noticed this in men, that when we get overwhelmed in a conversation, particularly in a conversation with a woman where we just can't seem to catch quite up, she says we suddenly start making man noises. And man noises are these. Oh, ooh, wow, gee, gosh, yeah. We don't exactly know what we're responding to, but we know we better be responding. And it's that kind of thing. With your child, if you can say, oh, man, wow, and then add a feeling where, oh, I bet that was exciting, or I bet that hurt, or I bet that was painful, or I bet that you were sad, or I bet you were afraid, or whatever. Those add this richness, if you will, to the listening. And it gives the child the sense that you're affecting them. The other thing, in terms of your body, is one of the things that's rather interesting about research is that research indicates that under stress, as much as 85% of the information that we get in the world comes in visually. It comes in through our eyes. It's not what we're hearing, it's what we're seeing that tips us off as to whether or not we ought to be responding or how we ought to be responding. So if the child is standing in front of you and their faces are all screwed up and their arms are crossed and they're talking kind of harsh, it probably doesn't hurt you as a parent to look right back, right on back to them. Because the goal is to say, you are having an effect on me. Because the reality is, until the child feels that they're having an effect on you, they're not going to be able to move to freedom, to problem solving, which is essentially what this is about. The other thing that I want to encourage you is to always take every behavior personally. I talked about this last week. And to be transparent. By taking behavior personally, what that means is if this child has just punched his brother or sister, that has to affect you personally. When you punched him, I felt. And what that does is it maintains the relationship between you and the child, which is real critical to problem solving. The other side, though, in terms of being transparent, what that means is that many of your kids don't guess well. And I want to encourage you to think about this in terms of many of the kids that I've worked with, certainly. If you have a mentally ill, maybe depressed, or mentally ill mom or dad, or you may have a drug or alcohol abusing mom or dad. You can be 5 years old. You can go home today with the behavior. Your mom or dad might laugh about it. You can go home tomorrow with the very same behavior. Your mom or dad might blow up about it. And it has nothing to do with your behavior. It has to do with their disability, their illness, whatever is going on in their lives. And so many of your kids have learned real early to avoid mom and dad. They don't get terribly hooked up. They don't pay attention. And so consequently, they may not read you very well. I've certainly worked with lots and lots of parents, foster parents, teachers, folks that are working with difficult kids. And the foster parent will be absolutely right on the edge of homicide. I mean, your face is red, your jaws are tight, your body's tight, your jaws are clenched, you're just sitting there like that. And the child will look at you and say, are you mad? Well, duh, yeah, as a matter of fact. But until you tell the child what's going on, they may not know. And this is also true on the other side. It's very important to tell a child when you're proud of them, when you're happy with them, when you're feeling good about them, because they may not read that either. They may have learned the very best thing to do is avoid mom and dad. when I was at the adoption agency, we had a little girl who was placed with us. We did permanency planning, so we did foster adoptions and some of those kinds of things. And this little girl came to us when she was only about 3.5 months old. At about 3 months, she had a mentally ill mother and father, and very difficult family. And they brought her, what they found, oh, thank you, I have a little bit brighter red pen here. We'll see if that works. What happened was she was crying, and her father tried to stop her from crying by stuffing something down her throat. And fortunately, the grandmother caught her. She wound up at Children's Hospital in Seattle, and then was placed with one of our foster families, who eventually did adopt her. It was about 18 or 19 months later. But during the adoption process, the judge ordered supervised visitation with biological mom and dad on a weekly basis, and that always went on in our office. And so several of us observed this little girl and did a lot of it. It was interesting stuff, and I was among those people. About 18 months, so she was with us 15 or 16 months, seeing her biological mom and dad every day, every week. What we found was that we were all sitting around just talking. The placement had gone through, things had gone fine. Bright, animated, cute little girl. What we found, one of the social workers mentioned, she said, did you guys notice, I don't think I ever saw that little girl make eye contact with her father. Now, she made eye contact with the rest of us. She certainly made eye contact with her mother and with her foster parents. It wasn't like she didn't make eye contact. But somehow or another, she had learned at 3 months this guy was dangerous to look at. And so she had already learned to avoid him. And that's one of those things. So some of the kids that are coming into your lives, they've had life experiences they probably can't even tell you about. They don't necessarily remember on a conscious level. But they're big deals. And so that's that business of making sure they understand how important they are and what an influence they have.
We have a question.
Sounds good.
This is from Ann in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I have a 4- and 8-year-old. They are siblings, boys. When mom is a no-show for visits because she's still using, the boys fight. The 8-year-old fights at school, and this aggression will last for about a week. What can Ann do? And they were drug-exposed infants.
Oh, that's so hard. Certainly, if one of the things you want to do with those kids is always normalize mom's behavior. So in other words, if you know that she's going to show up or she's not going to show up, whatever it might be, what you might do is build a little ritual in. If she shows up, you do a particular thing. If she doesn't show up, you do something different. And I don't know your kids real well. You want to think about food, because food appeals to the survival part of the brain. If you can have, okay, if your mom doesn't show up, what we do for sure every single time is we always have a hot fudge sundae, or whatever you choose, or a banana split, or whatever you want. Now, you want to think about the sugar and, and all the things that parents have to think about. But you want to build a little ritual in that says, either way, this is okay. So if mom appears, we do this, and it's a good thing. If mom doesn't appear, we do this, and it's a good thing. And try to ritualize it. For the 8-year-old in particular, I would certainly encourage you to do what you can to help him identify feelings. So I might have several, well, in fact, you might consider this after things have calmed down a little bit, but I might have several feelings on a card, on several cards, and he can choose them. Sometimes it helps if the kids have different color, like very light pink to very dark red cards, with the more powerful feelings on the darker cards. Anything else, but symbolically, what you're trying to do is give the child a place to put those feelings so that they don't have to just show up in fighting and some of the stuff at school. You also certainly want to work with the teacher if you can get that teacher involved so that the teacher knows what's going on, because he or she could also, potentially at least, build a ritual in so that if mom doesn't show up, come Monday, and we all know that, maybe a red card goes to school with the teacher, with the boy, then the teacher knows, okay, this is going on. And some of those kids, one of the things that we've worked with teachers about is to do what we call a time in, which means that the teacher actually brings that child in closer. They do a lot more activities with them, literally within arm's reach, so that they get a lot more touching from the teacher. And sometimes those things will help. But the other side of it is, this is a real bad experience for a kid. It's an enormous loss. His attachment, his belonging need, if you will, is severely challenged. And then when that happens, then he may believe that he doesn't have anybody but himself. And at that point, you need to move in closer, do what you can emotionally to try to help that child reconnect with you. So those are my suggestions. If you have more questions or whatever, please continue to ask. Let me also talk for a moment about this business of choices, this business of freedom, how important that is. What is interesting about decision makers, whoever they might be, is that creative problem solvers they don't come up with 15 new ideas. They just come up with one more than the rest of us. And one of the things that you always want to encourage is for a child to think one more step, whatever that might be. The other side of it, if you think about self-control, the art or the science or whatever, the essence of self-control is the ability to say no. One of the things that sometimes happens is we don't encourage our kids to say no. In fact, we may even get kind of set up where we don't want them ever saying no to us, and we kind of have this whole power and control thing going on with us. And I want to encourage you to think carefully about that. I've worked with kids who've been sexually abused, and one of the things that's rather fascinating about those kids is they're never encouraged to say no by the offender. And they're not given a choice about that. I worked with a teacher who was a first grade teacher. And whenever she gave her kids choices, not all of them, but some kids are very good at saying no, and you have to take that with a grain of salt. But when she gave kids choices, she said, would you like to do this one or this one? Which one do you want to say no to? And by default, of course, is saying yes to the other. But what she wanted these kids to do is practice saying no, and particularly saying no to an authority figure. Because she knows, as I do, how many kids get sexually abused. And she doesn't necessarily know who in her classroom has had that experience, but she does know that it's going on. It's the same thing with your children. It may well be that the best decision they can make is a decision to say no in their life, to set their own boundaries, to set their own limits. And so one of the things I would encourage you to do is always try to give a child who needs the opportunity a chance to say no. But the other side is encourage decision making. If you can get involved with any kind of brainstorming, that really helps. And one of the things that you can do, a game that families will play to help kids learn how to, and it's just for fun. You can do this in your car as you're driving along. It seems like we have more time with our kids in our car than anywhere. But do a game where I'm thinking of something red and round, and you just sort of play 20 questions. Well, is it a basketball? No. Is it something you eat? Well, yes. Is it something that I would like? Well, no. And you end up back and forth until finally they say, well, it's a tomato, and there you go. The idea is to help the child think, oh, is it this or is it that? And you give a lot of opportunities back and forth. But it also is just fun. It's just fun. But in all of that, kids are learning to make decisions. Well, not this, then that, and those kinds of things. And sometimes kids will really get into that. But I want to encourage you to help kids say no. The last little piece here, this business of laughter, this business of fun, this is for your family to define. But when we take a look at healthy families always build fun in. They always have an opportunity to laugh about something, to giggle about something. It's built into it. And keep in mind, many of your kids are coming from situations or settings where it was not fun, where the fun was always defined by somebody else, and it was always defined in a way that might have exploited them or hurt them or ignored them, cut them out of things, whatever it might be. So including children into fun is a big deal. And I would encourage you not to lose track of the amount of time that you have with any child. For those of you with ADD kids, it's somewhat even less. But we talk about time out. That if you're going to use time out, you use 1 minute for every year of age. So 6-year-olds get 6 minutes. And the adult attention span is only 12 minutes. So, I mean, you can only get up to about 12 minutes even with teenagers. But it's probably similarly true for fun, unless it's something highly engaging. With 6-year-olds, you may not want to do something that's going to last more than about 6 minutes. With 15-year-olds, may not want to last more than about 10 minutes. That's sort of how that goes. And so you want to think about the timing with your kids. Sometimes we try to get involved with something that's going to take us 3 hours, and we find the child's bored in 10 minutes, and then we feel bad, or we're mad at them, or all kinds of things happen. Be wise about that. Some of your kids have difficulty with impulse control. When we look at families, we look at teams, we look at anything, they're always built from the top down. First we belong, then we have influence, then we have freedom, then we have fun. When they come apart, they always come apart from the bottom up. The first thing that goes in any setting is the fun. And that's the big red flag in your family. When you're not having fun anymore, your children aren't having fun anymore, look out, something's wrong. And keep in mind, you can only fix it from the top down. I get to do a fair number of retreats during the year for all kinds of different businesses and interesting things. And it's interesting, what will often happen is there's trouble brewing. And the management, the company will say, oh, well, what we need is a retreat. And they pack everybody up, go off to some wonderful place, bring in pizza, and, you know, and some funny speaker, which sometimes is me. And you know, if you've ever been to those things, you know how it is. You're there about an hour and a half thinking to yourself, my lands, if they'd taken half the money they're wasting on this guy and just give it to us, we'd have more fun right now. And what has happened is the organization has tried to fix the problem at the wrong end. It's no different in your family. You cannot fix it by having fun. The idea is we always start at the top. If you go to a retreat with the intent of building your team, of hooking up, looking at touching folks, but just belonging, the odds are you'll have a great time. If you go to have fun, the odds are you won't, and it's that way. By the way, this is also true in marriages. My wife and I have been married almost 30 years, and I can tell you with absolute confidence that every minute of our marriage has been heaven for Donna. Okay, so I lied, and then I lied right in front of God and everybody here. The truth is, of course, we've had our times. We don't much like each other, and we're spitting and fussing, you know how it is, and we say, okay, we just need to get away. Let's get a baby. Let's get out of here. Let's go away for the weekend. And you do. You know, and you're in this wonderful hotel. You're spending $150 a night to have the very same fight you could have had for free in your kitchen. Okay? What has happened, we've tried to do the same thing. We've tried to fix our relationship by having fun. Now, I believe in retreats. I believe in getting away for weekends because it gives you a chance to reconnect. But you can do this in small pieces. But don't miss the lesson. If you don't remember anything else tonight, which is okay, remember to spend 4 minutes at those transition times, first in the morning, last at night, middle of the day when you reconnect after work or school, and just look at, and if you can, put your hands on those kids. Just touch it. Then you don't have to grab them and hang on any of that, but what that does is it helps them rebond. They're back in, they're in here, you belong to me, and here we go. That piece of it. Keep in mind, infants and the startled response. Remember that? I mean, when an infant's a brand new infant, and they're startled, the first thing they do is send their arms are like straight up, and what do they want? They want to be held real tight. I don't know that that ever goes away. And so sometimes the best thing you can do is just kind of hang on to your kid and say, you know, you're the most important person in my life, and I'm going to keep it that way. So that's that piece. Let me talk for a second about brains, going back to this model that we used last week. And particularly thinking about kids who are what we might consider out of control, who are really struggling. Now, if you recall, we talked about the brain being built in 3 pieces. We talked about the survival brain, the emotional brain, and the thinking brain. And we started down here with the survival. Then we talked about the emotional next, and finally the thinking brain on top. And this is a model that's being used, it's being used in a lot of different places, but it's kind of a handy little way to think about problem solving, any of those kinds of things. And we talked about structure. One of the things that I want to encourage you to keep in mind is the more difficult the child, the more important structure is, the more obvious it is that we have to be about our structure. So we talked about time structures, bedtimes, meal times, all those kinds of things. We talked about meals. One of the things that you might find is that sometimes if your kids, particularly when they're first fitting into your family, they may not want to eat very much that's different. They may want to have the same thing every morning. They may want to have the same thing at lunch. They may even want to have the same thing at dinner. And whether you're going to cook that way or not is your decision. But what you're hearing from the child is they're just trying to build predictability into their lives. And predictability is very, very important. And particularly if you think about being a young child, you've been moved from your home to a foster home, maybe to a receiving home, and then to your home. Maybe you're the 3rd or 4th or 8th foster home in their life. They've had 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 different caseworkers. They have had counselors in and out. They've had teachers in and out. They may have had parents, grandparents, who knows, all this stuff. And here they show up in your house, and the most predictable thing about their life is change. They don't know what's going to happen. And your goal, of course, is to try to stabilize that child, try to keep them in there. And so anything you can do to build in predictability really helps. I was working with a family last week. They have a 5-year-old daughter who's probably going to get diagnosed with an oppositional disorder, and certainly ADD, ADHD kinds of things. And what they have found is that they cannot vary her bedtimes, morning or night, by more than 5 minutes. They can't vary her meal times by more than about 5 minutes. And she eats fairly frequently. It's one of those, she seems to metabolize food quickly. And so there's a lot of work to structure this child. But what's interesting is it's beginning to work. She's beginning to find some sense of self-control in all of that. And so sometimes, this is real hard work. It's not easy, but it's that kind of thing. One of the other things I want to encourage you to think about is the child's room. Visual structure. I would encourage you to do two things. The first is try to have a relatively straightforward room. In other words, have fairly straight lines. If you can have things running at 90-degree angles, that helps the survival brain settle down. It's the same thing if you have the same place for them to eat every time, that they sit in the same chair every time. Some of those things also help the survival brain settle down. All of those things make sense. I would also, however, encourage you to have some place in the room where a child can look and see nothing at all. It's just a blank wall. Sometimes kids, because of the chaos in their lives, they will have every wall covered with posters. They'll have all kinds of things. They'll have stuff all over the floor. That kind of thing will happen, which I suppose is just child too. So you have to take, again, what I have to say with a grain of salt. But for some of your kids, if they have a place to look and see nothing, they'll find it calming. The other thing, even though we've talked about how important eye contact is, I would encourage you not to get too crazy about the child making eye contact with you. It's important for you to make eye contact with the child, but it isn't necessarily the reverse. I worked with a young man, he was referred to, he was 7, he was referred by school, and he was his dad, single dad, and they came in for counseling, and the boy was just struggling in school and all kinds. Turns out he was ADD and other things going on. But what's interesting about him is as soon as his dad would ask, I just observed them talking to each other, as soon as his dad would ask him a question, the boy would look away. And then his father would find that very upsetting and would say, "You look at me when I'm talking to you." And so he promptly would. And then he couldn't respond. And I thought, well, that's curious. The second thing I found is that when I sent Dad out of the room and I talked to the boy, he responded fine, so long as, number one, I didn't ask him to look at me, and number two, I was willing to wait at least 3 seconds. When I talked to Dad, I found that Dad could only wait about 1.5 seconds, maybe 2 seconds. So here what would happen is this little boy, his dad would ask him, bright kid, good kid, his dad would ask him a question, the boy would look away, the dad would say, "Look at me when I'm talking to you." He would look and then forget what his dad had asked. Then, if he did remember, as he began to answer, his father had already asked other questions because Dad could only wait 2 seconds, and the boy took 3 seconds to respond. By the way, my cure for that father-son was real fun. I had them in the room sit back to back, and I kept my hand on Dad's knee. And I wouldn't let him talk to his son until I lifted my hand off of his knee. And what I found was that if the boy didn't look at his dad, he listened very well, bright kid, really wanted to please, and Dad had to learn to wait just a little bit longer. But I would encourage you to pay attention to that. Some of your kids are trying to reduce their visual input in order to hear you better, and that's why they're looking away, and that's a piece of that survival brain stuff. When we take a look at the emotional brain, this business of feelings, I talked about last week how important it is to take the behavior personally, to make sure that the child affects you. When we talk about this kind of stuff, when we talk about attention deficit disordered kids, that becomes more difficult. You have to be wise about that. What we think happens to kids with ADD is that they are no different than the rest of us. They tend to be brighter, they tend to be brighter than your average child. But typically what we find is they can't ignore stimulation. So what happens to them is as we begin to talk, something else interrupts them. Somebody over here starts to whisper, the TV turns on, the phone rings, and they're bang, 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 and they forget what they're paying attention to. And one of the things that can sometimes happen with foster parents, I've seen this happen with all kinds of parents and teachers as well, is we become ADD with that child. We start trying to stimulate them and grab them and pay attention and have them focus, which is really no benefit to that child. So it's very important that we don't get caught up in that. I think we have another question.
Yes, actually, we have a couple. Here's an email from Yakima. The question is, when I tell my foster daughter, who is 14, that she can't go over to a friend's house, she sneaks out at night. She also dyes her hair blue and red, and I know it is just to upset me or to get back at me for not letting her to go out with her friends. How do I protect her and not let her get to me?
Let me say, I have two answers. First is, I'm glad she's getting to you. That's important. You don't want the child to not get to you, because by her getting to you, you're saying to her, you're so important, you can upset me, and that's important. So don't feel bad about that. I mean, if she's getting to you, it means that she's bonded with you, and she's really challenging the power influence kind of thing, and that's okay. And she's also, of course, pushing the whole choice thing, which is her job as a teenager. The blue-red hair, that's special, isn't it? Yeah. I don't know what to tell you about that except take a deep breath and hope that it just stays blue and red and not purple or green or bright orange or whatever. The other side, though, the sneaking out, that is a danger issue. That's a legitimate kind of a thing. And the reality is, unless, of course, you have all the windows alarmed or something like that, you're not going to know. And so when we come back to it, since you know that you've got a relationship with this kid. I mean, she's trying to drive you crazy, and it's working, and that's good news. So you've got that bonding. At that point, I think my best suggestion for teenagers is, number one, whenever you talk about them seriously, you take them out to eat. And number two, when things are calm, tell her the effect of the behavior on you. Tell her what happens to you, about your fear, about your concern for her, about your care for her, and how absolutely frightening it is when she goes out and she doesn't ask permission. Now, I think there needs to be a consequence, and we talked about that a little bit last week, but I would certainly encourage, she's offended you. She has to do things to help you. So I would suggest that you give her jobs, you give her chores, things to do right along with you. And it doesn't have to be evil. You can have her help you cook. You can have her help you do the laundry. You can have her help you do the dishes, whatever. The more bonding you do with her, the better the chances are going to be that as you talk to her, the odds are that she's going to stick around. But I would say focus on one behavior that matters to you, and I would guess the going out behavior is a lot more important than the blue hair, red hair behavior, and say, this is what I'm going to work on, this is what matters to me, and then bring her in. The more you can bring her in, the better the chances are that you're going to have an influence on her later in terms of changing her behavior. And with a 14-year-old, hang on. Just hang on, because someday they'll be 16 and it's better. Oh.
We have another question. This is from John in Dallas, Texas. My 13-year-old foster child has been involved in a car theft. I think he's in a gang. How do you tell, and how do you get them out?
Oh, my goodness gracious. Okay. 13-year-old in a gang is really scary. Okay. The first thing I would guess is that here's my best suggestion about the gang thing. Contact the police and ask them if they have particular gang behavior things that they're looking for, signs, dress codes. There's a uniform typically that goes with the gang, either a behavior uniform or a dressing up uniform. And you really want to make sure, you don't want to jump to that conclusion if it's not true. There's a lot of 13-year-olds who are wannabes who would like to be a part of whatever it might be. And ask, what's the second piece of that? Okay, so the first thing is make sure you know that he's in a gang. The second, if he's in it, if that's really the case, you're going to have to do everything you can to separate him from that peer group, which is probably about as difficult a job as I can imagine for any parent, foster parent or not. But if that's the case, that means that you may have to change schools, you may have to change in terms of what he does and where he is. If you can make it more difficult for the gang members to get involved, then that makes sense. The third thing you might consider, and this is kind of a wacko idea, but try everything, is to start bringing his friends into your house. Get to know as many of them as you can. Encourage them to come over. Include them as much as you can. That tends to take the sting, if you will, or the power out of, the mystery out of them. If you get to know them, you get to know their families, those kinds of things. Other things can start to happen. Certainly with a 13-year-old, you want to know as many of his or her peer groups, it wouldn't matter boy or girl, as many as you can in the peer group. So try to do what you can to hook up with that child.
This same person has a comment also. Thanks, this is great. My licensor said it's okay to watch. Hope it is okay to ask a question. Yes, John, it is wonderful that you're watching, and you certainly can feel free to ask questions. We want to let everybody know that if you live in a state where you have required continuing ed, all you need to do is to email me at zoca300, Z-O-C-A 300, at dshs.wa.gov. Email me with a request for a certificate. I will then send you electronically a testing device, an evaluation that will kind of query, ask questions about the particular workshop so that your licensor then has some assurance that you really did watch it. There's some documentation. Include your U.S. mailing address, and then I can send you out a certificate when you email that questionnaire back. So please remember to do that. We're happy to be of service to those in other states. There's another question. Okay. This is from Seattle. My foster child is African American and I am Caucasian. He tells me that I just don't understand him and that I don't understand anything that he does. I don't understand his culture, is what he says. This includes taking out the garbage. I don't think he's using survival brain or thinking brain. He is all emotion. Am I really setting him off, or is he just being a teen? Help.
He's a bright kid. Yeah, he's being evil. I mean, we'll just give him that. I mean, I never want to take the garbage. Actually, it was mowing the lawn that made me crazy. I think you have to admit you don't know his culture. That's true, and there's nothing wrong with admitting that. It doesn't mean you don't love him. It doesn't mean you can't get along. It doesn't mean you can't live in the same house together. And it doesn't mean that you can't learn, nor that he can learn about you. But I think you do have to keep in mind, yeah, he really does have a different culture. A friend of mine, great guy, Tom Tolson, African-American guy, he talks about his kids, that they are basically bicultural. They fit very well into their peer group, their African-American culture. They fit very well into the sort of the mainstream white culture. And he says they have 2 languages, they have 2 sets of friends, they have this whole thing going on, and they're good at it. And certainly your foster kid is no different. He's figured it out. In fact, if he's getting along with you, that alone is an indication that he's bicultural. But I would encourage you, if he's telling you that, and that's great, I mean, good for him, that means that you guys are bonded and he's willing to talk to you about those kinds of things. Then the next thing is have him educate you. Say, okay, fill me in. What is it? But the garbage thing, you know what? African-American families take their garbage out too. And I think it's kind of an interesting thing that he's choosing to use that as his lightning rod, if you will. So mostly I would say, no, sorry, your music might be cultural, but taking the garbage out, that belongs to everybody, and don't let him get away with that part of it. Now, I would enjoy it. I would just, I'd smile when he says it. I'd giggle a little bit and say, that is the best line. We had you on TV last night just asking about that line. That's a good one. And just kind of see what he does with that. But you don't need to make a big deal out of that. But the other side of it is, if he's part of your family, part of being in the family is doing chores. It's a piece of fitting in. And it's a reasonable thing to do. Now, 13-year-old boys, in general, are running on emotion. 13-year-old girls, in general, are running on emotion. And I think that's really true. And so one of the things that you want to do is take advantage of that. Most of the time, our experience with most difficult kids is they're far more motivated by relationship than by emotion. So in other words, you're not probably going to guilt him into very much, or you're not going to scare him into very much, or threaten him into very much. But certainly, if you can say, this has an impact on me, and let me tell you, both ways, for better and worse, that relationship building, that tends to improve the bond, and that tends to improve the movement in terms of change, in terms of behavior. So always make sure he knows that, how important he is to you and how much you like him, and then how much taking out the garbage is going to improve your life. Keep it personal. When you take this out, this is what happens to me. And when you don't take this out, this is what happens to me. And he just needs to know that stuff. But at least congratulate him for his creativity on the using garbage as a cultural issue. I like that. I'm very impressed. With this last little piece, we talked about the emotional brain. With this last little piece, the thinking brain, I would encourage you to do what you can to improve creativity. When we're working with difficult kids, one of the things about them is they do tend to be pretty creative kids. And sometimes we miss the creativity because we see it as a discipline issue. This last boy we were talking about, he's creative in using the cultural issue as a way to avoid taking out the garbage. That's a creative thing. And I think it's worth saying out loud, now that's an idea that never would have crossed my mind, or whatever you want to say about that. But those kinds of things are very helpful. But I would also remind you, you need to do 2 things. Whenever you have behavior that's not appropriate, you do need to have a reasonable consequence. And it needs to be something that affects you personally. And then the second thing is you have to teach and reward whatever behavior you want to replace it. So in other words, if you don't want this, we'll use this 13-year-old boy as a nice handy example, you don't want him pulling the culture card out to say, I don't want to take out the garbage because you're exploiting me or whatever he's doing. Say, well, if you don't take out the garbage, this is the consequence, but let me tell you how to manipulate me about doing the garbage better. And teach him the better way to avoid taking out the garbage, whatever that might be. And maybe it means trading off. Look, I don't want to take out the garbage, but I will do this instead. I'll peel the potatoes, or I'll walk the dog, or you can decide. But you can teach a child some things. And sometimes you just have to say, and the reality is, You got to take out the garbage. And then when he does, thank him all over the place. So one of the things that sometimes happens is we get caught up in these power struggles with these kids. They finally do follow through and do the very behavior that we've been pushing them to do, and then we forget that to thank them for doing it, that this is a movement in the right direction. And so keep in mind, all behavior, if it's rewarded, tends to happen again. If it's punished, it tends not to happen again. So you always want to reward the behavior that you're getting if it's the behavior that you want. And so it's that kind of a thing. You want to be thinking about that. The last little piece I wanted to talk about this evening was just about you. I just want to talk for a second about some self-care. There's a couple of things to keep in mind. The first is you are an important model in the children's lives that you're affecting. They see you, and they're going to pay attention to how you live your life as a way to give them a model for how to live their lives. Many of your kids have not had good models. They've not had healthy models. They've not had consistent models. And so here they are. They have this opportunity. They have you, and they're going to be paying close attention. When a friend of mine was a foster kid, and great guy, but he talked about, he was 9 by the time he was placed with the foster family that he wound up living with as he went through high school. But when he was 9, he walked into that family, and he looked at the dad in particular and said, what am I supposed to be? And he used his dad as his foster dad as his model, because his biological dad and mom, for that matter, were very difficult, inconsistent, drinking a lot, and those kinds of things. So for you, the first thing is keep in mind your modeling behavior. The second thing is that we're talking about self-care, just taking care of yourself. We talked about 5 different areas. If you do these things, you'll feel better. And it tends, if your stress is down, you tend to be more creative, just like the rest of us, and you tend to be better at managing the kids and managing life. And so I just want to give you these 5 areas of self-care. We start up here with physical. There's no particular order, but when we think about physical self-care, we're really talking about just 3 things. Number 1, you want to eat smart. It's easy to eat junk food, which is not probably in your best interest, but you want to eat smart. You want to rest. It's very important to keep in mind that until your body rests, you don't get to have a chance for it to repair. And finally, you want to move. You want to exercise. And you need about 100 minutes per week of aerobic activity to keep your heart rate. You want to get your heart rate up and going, and about 100 minutes a week. If you took a 20-minute brisk walk 5 nights a week, that would get in your 100 minutes. It's those. If you took a 15-minute brisk walk every day, you get pretty close to 100 minutes. The idea is to just give yourself an opportunity to move. So basically, you got to move, you got to eat, and you got to rest. But if you do that, if you model that behavior, that really helps. Now, some of you have kids who are pretty active. You may be shooting hoops. Good. Whatever it is, it doesn't make any difference. Psychological self-care is the next one. And that is to develop insight, to understand yourself better. And one of the things that we certainly suggest is that you read. Don't lose track of opportunities. There's some wonderful self-help books out there. Now, the trick to a self-help book is to read the book and apply it to your life, not those around you. But that's the idea. So read that book, get into it, pay attention to it. But also, don't ignore counseling. It always helps. And there's all kinds of counseling. There's informal counseling with friends. And then, of course, there's formal counselors with therapists. But give yourself a chance. The nice thing about counseling is you get another perspective, and that really improves the opportunity to think differently, to think outside the box, if you will. Social self-care. My goodness, whatever you do, don't isolate yourself. Never miss a party. Make sure that you hang out with friends doing whatever. If you're part of a club or a group or an organization, good news. I don't know if you're in a group of other foster parents, but it really pays, if you can, to get together with other people, compare notes. What you're going to find is you're not nearly as crazy as you think you are, because they're all crazy just like you. And your kids are just about as difficult as everybody else's kids. It's kind of that nice little experience. So that's it. By the way, you might also want to own a dog, not a cat. I'm kidding about that. Being a Washington Husky, it's just one of those little things. Spiritual self-care. Now, this is not about church or religion necessarily, but this is about what do you do to gain perspective, to take a step back. There's more to life than going to work and dealing with kids every day. What is it that you do to take a step back? So don't ignore nature. My goodness, it is amazing to get out and just take a look. If you have a garden, good. Take a vacation. Do anything at all, volunteer. I mean, you already sort of are giving yourself away, but to volunteer, give yourself away to others. And sometimes just random acts of kindness count as volunteering. It isn't that you have to go, work with the Boy Scouts or something like that, but you can just do something for somebody else for no particular. I'll tell you a quick story about my grandmother. My grandmother and grandfather lived together. Well, my grandfather died when he was 93 and left my grandmother. And she lived right across the street from a guy who was worked in maintenance in the Federal Way School District. And she had these big spotlights outside her house that she would turn on at night so she would feel safe. And I suppose it wasn't shining in his window one day, and he noticed that it was out. And he came over to her house with his ladder, and he went and climbed up on the peak of their roof and changed both lights, because he, being a maintenance guy, he knows if one goes out, the other's likely to. So he changed them both, came down, had tea, and I have to tell you, he probably made her month. I mean, it was just this act of kindness. He volunteered. So that kind of thing. Certainly, if you go to church or temple or synagogue, don't miss it, okay? Pursue your religious activities. They're good for you, gain perspective, and it gives you an opportunity to kind of think in a different way, and it's a good thing. And then finally, pursue intellectual self-care. Do things on purpose to improve your mind. Games and puzzles work, taking classes or workshops, having an opportunity to attend a seminar, anything at all that you can do, but the idea is to get involved with something that just is good for your brain. What we look for in people is balance, balance, balance. There's a tendency in America to think if I'm eating smart, exercising, and resting, I have good self-care, and it's 20% of your life. All 5 of those areas are good for you. But if you do them, you're going to get 2 experiences. Number 1, your stress will go down, guarantee it. And number 2, you're going to model good self-care behavior. And the children that you're raising and modeling their lives for are likely to take that with them, and they will be healthier in their future as well. Well, it's about 7:30. My goodness, any more questions?
No, I don't think we have any right now.
All right. Well, I suppose then we are signing off. Did you have anything else that you want to add?
Yeah, we just want to say that we appreciate the challenges that you're dealing with, as evidenced by these questions tonight. We also want to say that what you're doing is the ultimate patriotic act in this nation, because our nation is stronger and will be stronger because you cared enough to step to the plate and give a child a home. And we just want to appreciate that and let you know that at every level in our organization, and I'm sure in child welfare organizations across this nation, you have our ultimate respect and appreciation. And when the going gets tough, remember that 100 years from now, what kind of house you lived in, what kind of car you drove, what kind of vacations you took will really not matter a whole lot. But what you did for a child can actually have the effect, a positive effect for generations to come. And that's something to hold on to. We want to thank you for your time tonight. Check back with us from time to time. You'll see when these future workshops are going to be aired. Let us hear from you. And again, thank you so much for caring. Good evening. Very good.
Yeah.